you're not going to win a fight against the U.S. Army. If you can't break, the lines at Blair Mountain with state troopers and mine guards, you're certainly not going to be able to do that when the full arm of the federal government comes down on you.
Driving through the mountains of Logan County, West Virginia, you can pass through Blair Mountain, only marked by a single historic placard. The now isolated landscape once held the largest labor uprising in the history of the United States.
There's nothing else like this in the country. Nowhere else can you go up and find, trenches and thousands upon thousands of spent cartridges, and nothing ever like this has ever happened in American history. Until you go all the way back to the Civil War, of course.
It's been more than 100 years since thousands of miners fought against the oppression of the coal operators, a group of private detectives known as the Baldwin Felts, and local law enforcement trying to keep miners from unionizing.
The only people that wanted the union were people working, the people who was producing the coal and whose lives were at risk, and they knew it, right? And they weren't getting paid what they should be. At the end of 2 weeks' work, when the rent came out of their check, the company store came out of their check, the tools that they bought came out of their check, and of course the only medical coverage they had was the company doctor that they paid for. Many times miners just wouldn't get anything. So you're working in these dangerous conditions and not getting paid for it for the most part. So this friction of the workers and everybody else, for that matter, kept building and building and building.
The battle ended in Logan County on September 2nd, 1921, when federal troops were sent by President William G. Harding to stop the violent uprising.
It is very much a World War I battlefield in the middle of the West Virginia hills.
But the fight for the rights of West Virginia coal miners continues to this day.
Who is the last miner that we're going to ask to die for the last pound of coal?
Historians cite the West Virginia mine wars spanned the decade between 1912 and 1921, but the struggle between coal miners and coal operators and the fight for the rights and safety of workers had been present since the industry began.
We're talking about working class solidarity of people who did not have the same skin color, they did not speak the same language, they did not worship the same gods, but they shared class. And they wanted a better future, not only for them, but for the people who would come after them.
The violent tactics to keep the Union out of the state had only continued to escalate through the turn of the century and through the First World War. West Virginia, with billions of tons of bituminous coal underneath her soil, saw a boom after the railroad was laid in the 1880s, with the total coal production growing from less than 500,000 tons in 1867 to 89 million tons in 1917. Coal companies would come into the hills and set up their mines, building company towns to surround them, providing homes, stores, and schools to their employees, with their wages coming in the form of company scrip.
You have to shop where we tell you to shop. You have to buy the goods that we sell. You have to live in the house that we've built for you, and you have to pay us rent that is coming out of your paycheck.
This system made the coal operators boss, landlord, and law, with a strong mine guard system to keep their employees in line.
You can't even talk in the street with your neighbors because the company bosses are there telling you, and they acted like they were the police, bringing law and order and protecting property. But what they were really doing was controlling citizens, even to the point of taking constitutional rights away.
To keep prices low and profits high for those operating in the southern West Virginia coal fields, they had to keep the newly formed United Mine Workers Association out by any means necessary.
What happens after the miners start trying to organize is about 20 plus years of violence on varying degrees between the union miners and the coal companies.
They had some die in order to establish the union. And they all had to go through a lot of suffering and fighting the coal companies and the coal company guards and the scabs they would bring in with them, you know. They had to fight to get the Union brought in.
The first major violent conflict would play out in 1912, when more than 7,000 miners from Paint Creek and Cabin Creek in Kanawha County would go on strike after a contract dispute with coal operators.
The contract on Paint Creek expired. They belonged to the Union already. The people on Cabin Creek didn't. They said, this is a good opportunity for us too. We're gonna walk off the job here.
Their demands for going back to work, interestingly enough, do not include a pay increase. The companies actually did try to buy them off by offering to increase their wages, but the demands ultimately get to their basic freedoms as Americans. They demand recognition of their right to form a union, recognition of their right to freedom of speech.
The Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike would span over a year.
The governor at the time, William Glasscock, called out the National Guard 3 separate times over the course of this strike because Baldwin Felts agents flooded into the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek fields and would intimidate and brutalize miners who were trying to organize. The miners fought back. The governor would send in the National Guard. They'd stay for about 1 or 2 weeks, and then the National Guard would come out. The declaration of martial law would end, and the violence would start flaring up again.
Finally, a deal would be made to recognize the Union after Indiana Senator John W. Kern adopted a resolution calling for a senatorial investigation into the strike and the state government, marking the first time in the country's history the Senate would call for such an investigation into one of the states. Demand for energy would only grow. 1914 brought World War I, with America joining in 1917. King Coal fueling the U.S. war machine.
A lot of West Virginia coal miners did volunteer to fight in the war, but miners themselves were exempt from conscription, and the entire time, whether they're fighting overseas or they're in the mines producing mining coal, they're being told that they're making the world safe for democracy.
Things would not be easier for the miners who made it home from the front, and the 3 years after the end of World War I would be full of strikes and conflict.
Martial law declared. Again, it was declared several times during this series of strikes that were taking place in Mingo and McDowell County right after World War I.
An extraordinary session would be called by West Virginia Governor John Cornwell in the summer of 1919, which led to the creation of the West Virginia State Police as a reaction to the violence growing in the coal fields.
We had a lot of coal companies that were probably paying, helping out law enforcement agencies to kind of side with them on strikes or on issues that were occurring at the time. And Governor Cornwell wanted somebody to be impartial, wanted a law enforcement agency that could not be bought by a coal company or be on the side of miners.
And the spark to what would become known as the Battle of Blair Mountain would strike in the spring of 1920 in the town of Matewan. This tattered red bandana, now in a glass case in Matewan, West Virginia, once served as a symbol of resistance and a precursor of the blood that would flow on Blair Mountain. After decades of rising tensions and injustice in the state's southern coal fields, this simple piece of cotton and dye was used by thousands of men to silently but boldly show their alliance as the largest labor uprising in the country's history started to play out. On May 19, 1920, a group of private detectives hired by coal operators known as Baldwin Felts agents would arrive by train to the town of Matewan, set to evict miners living at a coal camp just outside of town. Entering into the struggle between miners and the agents was Matewan Police Chief Smiling Sid Hatfield and Mayor Cabell Testerman.
When Albert and Lee Felts told the mayor that they were coming to do those evictions, they couldn't produce a warrant. which of course meant that the evictions were legal. So once they did go up to the coal camps and start trying to evict people from their homes, Sid Hatfield, it's kind of fuzzy how it all happens, but Sid Hatfield may have organized several dozen miners and deputized them into his service. He got on the phone with the sheriff of Mingo County, asked if the Baldwin Felts men had any right to be there and any legal authority. When the sheriff said no, he basically told him, well, if they try anything, they're not leaving Matewan alive.
And a confrontation would lead to a shootout.
Gunshots start to ring out. It's still not exactly clear who fired the first shot, but over the course of the next 5 minutes, there's bullets flying all over Matewan, all over across the tracks. And after the battle, both Felts brothers, as well as 5 other Baldwin Felts detectives, were dead. The mayor has been shot, and he will die on his way to the hospital in Williamson. And 2 unarmed miners were also killed.
The conflict, known as the Matewan Massacre, but more recently as the Battle of Matewan, only strengthened the push for unionization in Mingo County. Sid Hatfield would become a figurehead of the movement, and after being acquitted for his role in the Matewan shootout, a target was on his back. By a year later, he'd be accused and charged with blowing up a coal tipple in McDowell County alongside his deputy. Both men would be ambushed on the courthouse steps in Welch.
They're walking with their wives and a police escort up the steps to the McDowell County Courthouse. At the top of the steps is C.E. Lively, who had been a Baldwin Felts spy operating in Matewan, along with a half dozen other Baldwin Felts men armed with pistols and rifles. They immediately opened fire, and Sid and Ed were shot somewhere around 20 times. They were ambushed, they were unarmed, and there were even reports that the Baldwin Felts men planted guns on them to make it look like they were armed. The only law enforcement officer who had stood up for the miners in West Virginia up to this point had been killed in cold blood. And this really does send a message to the miners. Like, we've tried to do everything legally. We've defended ourselves. Something has to be done about this.
With miners in Mingo County under martial law and unconstitutionally imprisoned, it was on August 7, 1921, that thousands of miners gathered in Kanawha County, with union leaders and labor activists like Mother Jones, Bill Blizzard, Frank Keeney, and Fred Mooney.
You have about 5,000 people gathering to hear the speeches and try to get Governor Ephraim Morgan to intervene and come up with some kind of compromise between the union and the coal operators. So it's even that late in the game that the UMWA is trying to resolve this through negotiation. And Governor Morgan refuses to have any sort of meaningful conversation with them. And it's at that point that they really see the only way that they're going to be able to liberate the miners who are being held under martial law in Mingo. They're starting to mobilize for the march, and Mother Jones shows up with a telegram that she claims is from President Warren Harding. And she says that if the miners lay down their arms and go home, Harding has promised to mediate the disputes between them and the coal companies. And when she's challenged on this, Frank Keeney asks to see the telegram for himself, and she tells him to go to hell. He eventually does get eyes on it and says it's a forgery.
On August 25, 1921, an estimated group of more than 10,000 miners would organize a march that would take them from Kanawha County to Bloody Mingo.
They arrested a whole bunch of miners. Then they do things like tear up a bunch of the tents, steal the food. They stop the food shipments that were coming in because the families were dependent upon food that was being shipped in from the United Mine Workers. And suddenly you have women and children that are starving, have no food, they have no water. They poured gasoline into the wells they were using for water. The state troopers did this. And then all of the men were arrested, just held without habeas corpus.
But they'd be met by a militia of mine guards, West Virginia State Police, and county sheriff's deputies, led by the czar of Logan County, Sheriff Don Chafin.
Blair Mountain was initially a rescue mission.
No armed mob will cross Logan County.
The Battle of Blair Mountain was about the reestablishment of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That's important. They felt that they were being denied the Bill of Rights. And it also meant they weren't trying to replace the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They weren't trying to overthrow the government or set a new system in place. They weren't trying to tear it down. They were trying to get what they thought were their God-given rights. And they felt they had no other recourse but to turn to violence.
Miners were being held under martial law in Williamson, the county seat of Mingo County, without due process. And so as they were going to Mingo, they did intend to unionize the coal fields as they marched, but also free their brothers and sisters who had been wrongfully held in jail.
As a band of marching miners made their way through Logan County, set to free their imprisoned brethren in Mingo County, they'd come face to face with the opposing army led by Logan County Sheriff Don Chafin at Blair Mountain.
The battle was going to happen at Blair no matter what.
And Chafin, as the guardian of the coal industry in Logan County, was, their kind of enforcer. And he ran Logan County almost independently. It was almost his personal fiefdom at that time.
They knew that this was happening. This had been reported on as they were gathering in Charleston, in Marmette. They knew that this march was a thing that could happen. Don Chafin was the sheriff of Logan County at the time, and he was notorious union buster.
Where the miners have the red bandanas, Don Chafin and King Cole's army had white armbands that they wore on their left arm. They had their own passwords as well. So on August the 31st, two patrols meet up on Blair Mountain, and the miners give the challenge question, how do you come? The response is supposed to be, I come creeping. Don Chafin's men respond back, amen. And that's when they know they've made contact with the enemy.
They had a machine gun set up here on the north crest, which is behind us. And from there, they could see the whole valley. And fire down in the White's Trace branch is where the miners would have tried to come up, which would have been absolute suicide if they did try it, in large numbers. That's why they tried guerrilla warfare. They tried to flank the line, which they came around the point over there and tried to come this way, shoot sideways into the line.
So we know that the fighting consisted of a lot of tree-to-tree fighting. Miners would try to worm their way up the hillsides from tree to tree.
The 4-day battle would only end with the arrival of federal troops.
When the government came down into West Virginia, they immediately put down their arms. First of all, they weren't stupid. Okay, you're not going to win a fight against the U.S. Army. All right, if you can't break, the lines at Blair Mountain with state troopers and mine guards, you're certainly not going to be able to do that when the full arm of the federal government comes down on you.
The miners who were marching were never marching to overthrow the government outright, certainly not the federal government. And a lot of the miners who took part in the march had served in the U.S. Army themselves. There were miners who actually wore their World War I uniforms on the battlefield. They carried their service rifles. They saw themselves, and the miners in general saw themselves as patriots who were fighting for their civil and constitutional rights, which were being denied to them by a state government that was under the influence of the coal industry.
Many of them thought that having the Army come in, because a number of them were veterans, by the way, and is that they thought that the military might be some kind of fair arbitrator between the two. And it was kind of a bit naive of some of them to think, okay, the military is here, well, that's not controlled by the coal industry. Maybe they will, you know, help us out or come down on our side. And so they did. They surrendered right away without firing a shot at any U.S. troops.
You can fight the government of West Virginia, but by God, you can't fight the government of the United States.
The miners would head home, and a lot of what really happened over the week would never be repeated by those who were there.
We have a lot of varying accounts of how many people were killed and how many people weren't. There's only around 17, 18 people maybe officially named as dead, but there are some accounts even coming from the coal company side, where they're saying that 50 people were killed in a certain day and things like that. Miners tended to hide their deaths and bury them in secret, and so did the coal companies, because neither side wanted to reveal to the other what had. And you had a lot of, shall we say, anonymous people fighting in this battle. So we really don't know the full number of dead, and there could very well be dead people that are buried on Blair Mountain or on the battlefield proper or in that general vicinity. We don't know because we've not been given access to study the whole thing.
More than 500 miners would be indicted for murder, conspiracy, and treason against the state following the Battle of Blair Mountain.
The most severe charge was treason against the state of West Virginia, and this was reserved for people like Bill Blizzard, Frank Keeney, Fred Mooney, people who were part of the leadership in the state for the UMWA. The trials ended up moving elsewhere in the state. The most high-profile trials occurred in Charlestown, in the Jefferson County Courthouse, where 60 years prior, John Brown had stood trial for treason against then the state of Virginia for attempting to incite a slave rebellion with the raid on Harper's Ferry. This irony was certainly not lost on the press, and I would imagine not lost on the miners themselves.
There's a lot of corruption in these trials, and the miners, by the way, are a part of it too. The United Mine Workers, they send organizers to Jefferson County, where Charlestown is, a few weeks ahead of this, and they send people disguised as Bible salesmen. Right, and this was a time when you knocked on a stranger's door, they would actually let you into their home. That would never work today. But, you know, where people would let you into their, so they would knock on somebody's door and come in and they were selling Bibles. And they would say, oh, we just came from trying to sell Bibles in Logan County, and you wouldn't believe this Don Chafin guy. You wouldn't believe what's going on down there and how they're all being used and abused, you know. Oh, it was a great little scheme.
The treason trials would run through 1924. The majority of the miners being acquitted of their charges. And the violent fight for unionization would only see dwindling numbers as the country moved through the Roaring '20s and towards the Great Depression.
A part of the issue with many of the documentaries and histories and books that have been written about Blair Mountain is they go from the Battle of Blair Mountain and then immediately jump to 1933. When the Roosevelt administration begins to legalize unions and the coal fields get unionized. And that's kind of to put a pretty bow around things, right? But that was a tough decade between Blair Mountain and between the Roosevelt administration. First of all, the 1920s saw the highest percentage and the highest number of coal mining disasters and deaths in West Virginia. They were averaging over 400 deaths a year in the coal mines of West Virginia. from the midnight in the decade right after Blair Mountain. So the decade after Blair Mountain was the deadliest time in West Virginia to be a coal miner, and it was at a time when they had completely deunionized.
And 90 years later, a second battle would happen, this time for Blair Mountain.
In West Virginia, everything is political, except politics, and that's personal.
Okay, I was always a sort of a history buff. I loved history. But the strange thing about it, I didn't know anything about my local history. I didn't know about the mine wars. I didn't know about Blair Mountain. And I come from a union family, you know, all my fourth generation, you know, coal miner. But yet didn't know my history.
The Battle of Blair Mountain ended on September 2nd, 1921. The violent chapter in West Virginia's history would become a footnote.
After the Battle of Blair Mountain, miners really didn't talk about what had happened. They had lost the battle, and they'd taken a vow of silence not to discuss union business in public. So they took that very, very seriously. That creates a vacuum which allows for the coal companies and the state government to really shape the narrative of the Battle of Blair Mountain and the Miners' March. If they talk about it at all, they're talking about it from the perspective of the state and from the coal industry, which is that this unorganized mob of miners was trying to overthrow the state government. And that's not what the miners were trying to do. They were patriots who were fighting for their rights as Americans. So it really takes 2 or 3 generations for people to start coming forward and telling the people's side of this story, the miners' side.
It wasn't in the history books. It was deliberately taken out of the history books. They didn't want people knowing this history because they didn't want the coal industry portrayed in any kind of negative light. You know, coal is West Virginia, coal is wonderful, coal puts food on your table. There are only the positives that are emphasized in the classroom for a couple of generations. And it's not until, you know, there's a few books written about it in the late 80s and 90s, it gets a little bit of attention.
In 1991, when the W.Va and West Virginia University partnered to do a survey of the battlefield and to find out where, you know, the actual sites were and all that, and ultimately to have a park on the mountain to commemorate the, you know, the battle and the march and all that. And after the report was issued about the survey, the UMWA and Arch Coal negotiated an agreement to have part of the battlefield set aside. It has only 8.5 acres on top of the mountain on what's called the North Crest. 8.5 acres doesn't even begin to tell the story, you know. And all it is just one site associated with the defenders. It didn't have anything to do with the miners, but there's sites everywhere associated with the miners. And if you're going to commemorate it, you got to cover both sides.
It wouldn't be until 2008 that Blair Mountain would be considered for the National Register of Historic Places. They'd get the designation by spring of 2009, but would be taken off before the year was up. With 2 of the major coal operators holding permits that cover most of the land, the plan was to use mountaintop removal mining on the property.
There was, according to market prices at the time, it was about $200 million worth of coal. It's not a small change here either. Okay, so this is a lot of money we're talking about here. And so it's not just about destroying history or anything. There's a lot of money.
The push to preserve the history of the miners and the country's labor uprising would fall to the community.
Friends of Blair Mountain joins up with some other groups, many of them environmental groups. And what we do is we end up planning a march that's going to retrace the steps of the miners from 1921. And it's going to be a protest march to save the battlefield.
In 2011, the march would gain national attention.
I was kind of instrumental in one of the first people probably in the local that supported the 2011 march on Blair, which was kind of controversial in a way because there was a lot of environmental kids involved in it for other reasons. But my whole purpose of it was this is a mountain that had Union blood shed on it. It had Union history and it needed to be saved.
We were going to have that march to Blair, and we were determined to do it, and we did. And everything from greasing the rocks and blocking the roads to make it impossible for us to get there. They pulled those big boulders out by hand, young people, all with a rope, pulling them to unblock the roads so they could go, and because they weren't going to stop.
It would take 9 years and countless legal battles between multiple state and federal agencies, but Blair Mountain would finally return to the National Register of Historic Places in 2018.
It has been on the National Register of Historic Places, which really, as far as protection, it doesn't really provide much protection. It just recognizes that, it is an historical site. The owners, they're still allowed to do whatever they want to do with their land. The coal companies can mine on it, people can build on it or whatever, But it needs to be a national monument.
Despite no official monument to mark the significance of the battle, the push to preserve the history of the Coal Wars did not end in Logan. In 2015, the Friends of Blair Mountain, a group of Southern West Virginia residents, activists, and retired Union miners, came together to create the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum in Matewan to honor and preserve the vital piece of West Virginia and labor history.
Matewan is one of the few towns in our state that is a national landmark, which is another layer of significance and recognition. And Matewan is best known as the town that stood up against this mine guard system in 1920. Matewan was really ripe to see this preservation of history happen.
We did open up a museum there, and it's grown and grown since then. We've even had to move into a bigger building, and it's really helped. I think it's helped the town of Matewan too. It's brought a lot of businesses back, and we've got a staff, permanent staff. We've got archives. People can come and do research, and all that. And it just keeps growing and growing.
While the fight to protect the history of Blair Mountain and the miners who fought on the land continues in the coal fields, the generations to follow would take up the mantle of those men as the Union and its coal miners would see more strikes, more deadly accidents, and the never-ending fight for their rights.
The fights never really ended. Thinking about the Black Lung strikes, the Massey strike here in 1984 and 1985, the Pittston strike down in Virginia in 89 and 90, even going into the strikes in Alabama a couple of years ago. Miners are still fighting the same battles today and trying to keep the ground that they've won, make gains where they can, and really just keep from losing everything that they've fought for.
You would think in a state that continuously brags on miners all the time, this brags on, that why don't you actually do something for them? But when it really comes to doing something for the coal miner, you very seldom find somebody in our legislature that stands up for the miner. They're always standing up for the company. We know that, the union knows it.
Many strikes and labor disputes would happen from when the miners at Blair Mountain would surrender their arms to the modern day. Workers were still risking their lives to go underground, and toward the 1950s, introduction of mechanization into the mines would dramatically increase the level of coal dust they were exposed to.
Black lung is the scarring of the lungs that's caused by breathing in coal or sandstone dust. Sometimes they call the sandstone silica or silicosis. And coal and silica both scar the lungs up in a terrible way, so you can't breathe and eventually you die. And miners have been getting black lung and silicosis ever since there was mining.
In 1969, a miner working at a Raleigh County coal mine would give a signal and begin a strike after contract disputes between coal operators and the UMWA had failed as the union pushed for lower dust standards and for the companies to compensate miners who were disabled by black lung.
There was a strike in 1969 of 40,000 miners in West Virginia, and they marched on their capital. I said, we're not leaving here. We're just not leaving, and we're not going back to work until you fix this. And so we had this first state law passed, not because somebody wanted to do it, but in spite of these people. The power of workers sticking together and taking a collective action against someone or something, or to pass some kind of legislation.
Soon, every coal mine in the state would be shut down and 40,000 miners would be on strike, taking the push for black lung legislation to the West Virginia Capitol every day. The effort worked, and Governor Arch Moore would sign legislation that would give compensation to miners with black lung. But by the end of the year, federal legislators would pass the Federal Coal Mine and Safety Act of 1969. Not only giving more protections and compensation for black lung, but increasing safety procedures following the Farmington disaster only a year prior that led to the deaths of 78 miners.
And we would not have gotten a federal law in 1969 had Farmington not exploded and killed 78 men just like that. And what was the difference? The difference was relatively simple. This was televised all over the United States, New York, Florida, California, Montana, everybody watched this. And they watched these kids crying about their fathers, and these mothers crying about their sons, and these wives crying because their husbands were trapped in this mine and they couldn't get them out. And the nation itself said, no more of this. We went 100 years with the coal industry saying there's no such thing as black lung. The medical community here in West Virginia, no such thing as black lung. The legislature, no such thing as black lung. They didn't care, quite frankly, what was happening to these miners. You could either get covered up, blown up, or choked to death if you had a job in the mines.
In April 2025, in an effort by the Trump administration and the newly formed Department of Government Efficiency to curb federal spending, it was announced the Department of Health and Human Services would be cutting the NIOSH, or National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health workforce, from 1,400 workers to less than 200.
As part of the federal mine safety law, which West Virginia miners struck and picketed to create back in the 60s, every miner, coal miner in America, is entitled to have periodic health screenings to determine if they're developing black lung. And if they're developing black lung, they have the right to transfer to a non-dusty job. This administration came in and decided they didn't like that program. They wanted to shut the whole thing down. Miners use that program. They have to, in order to exercise your transfer rights under the federal black lung transfer law, you have to go and be examined by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. So the only way to exercise that right under the federal law is to be examined in this particular program.
A lawsuit would be filed by a Kanawha County miner against the federal government and DHHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
There's no program like it elsewhere in the world to monitor and really protect the lungs of miners. And when the Trump administration decided to shut down these health surveillance programs, coal miners said, no way. Our work is too dangerous. We're dying too young. We are not letting this administration stop us from these protections. And we're fighting the federal government now over NIOSH. We've fought the federal government over the black lung program to improve that program over the years. It's the same thing miners have always done. Fight the companies, fight the government, and fight them all again.
U.S. District Court Judge Irene Berger would grant a preliminary injunction in May that the DHHS could not legally end services at the Coal Workers Health Surveillance Program, ordering that federal workers return from having been placed on administrative leave. West Virginia State Senator Shelley Moore Capito also announced that after speaking with Secretary Kennedy, 100 workers would be returning to the job at the Morgantown NIOSH facility.
We're still making the case here that this is a unique institution that does research in a very unique way to protect our coal miners, our firefighters, and others, and has a record of success.
A jury trial over the lawsuit is expected in spring of 2026.
Most of the people that actually have black lung just die from it without any benefits. That's how, what really kills you is they're wanting to cut something. They want you dead before they ever compensate you, you know. And if any other disease was treated like black lung is, suppose you had cancer and somebody told you, yeah, you got cancer, it's just first stage, you know, but we're not going to do anything to it and everything. But when you get to fourth stage, you know, we may give you a few benefits, you know. Well, they don't treat cancer like that. They start treating it as soon as you find out. With black lung, no, you get to a certain degree for them to meet, and they're the ones that made what that degree is, you know. It didn't actually matter how he could breathe or anything. They come up with their own regulations. So, you know, it works against us.
I'm a miner at heart, so I dig away out.
I think West Virginians, we struggle with identity and like who we are. So sometimes we're labeled as a coal state. And I think that's true. There's a lot of coal that's been mined from these mountains. Many generations of my family who have mined that coal and who have worked underground. But fewer people know about the coal miners that powered this American labor movement.
In 1921, an estimated 10,000 miners marched from Marmet to Blair Mountain, determined to free imprisoned miners in Mingo County and unionize. The West Virginia Office of Miners' Health and Safety and Training estimates that in 2025, around 12,000 coal miners are employed in the state. The fight for the rights of the miner may not be the same as it was 100 years ago.
The union was given to us. Those before us, our dads and our grandpas, they had some die in order to establish the union. And they all had to go through a lot of suffering in fighting the coal companies and the coal company guards and the scabs they would bring in with them, you know. They had to fight to get the union brought in. And the union was brought in for one purpose, pretty much, and that was to try to improve the wages and benefits of the families, the miners and their families.
No one can accurately guess what the West Virginia coal industry will look like in the next 100 years.
We'll always have coal mining. It's never going to be what it used to be in the 50s or 60s or even the 80s or the 90s because the coal just isn't there anymore. It takes millions of years to make new coal, and that's not happening on our timetable around here. So we can be smart about the future of coal. We can preserve coal production as a critical component of our economy, but the only humane way to do that is by investing in the protections of the people who will continue to mine that coal as we do grow and diversify our economy for the future.
This creek here that we live on, at one time there was probably 4,000 or 5,000 coal miners on it. They mined all the coal out. Now, was that a war on coal? You know, who are you going to blame for that? And that's where all these miners worked all these years, and it's not a renewable resource, you know. And what is left is, it's too expensive to mine, so you want to get mad at somebody, get mad at capitalism, because capitalism runs everything and determines what kind of fuel this country's going to burn, you know. And it always has, and it probably always will. But as far as a war on coal, there was a war on coal miners. Definitely a war on unions.
And the keepers of the history of the mine wars will continue to fight to preserve the history left buried on Blair Mountain, with the hopes that one day their efforts will allow for all the history to be uncovered.
One of the goals that we have at the museum is to have a site here at Blair. We want people to be able to come and visit.
Yeah, it just makes the most sense.
And a national park or a state park where people can come and reflect, and the mountain will be protected but also enjoyed, an educational space for people to come and learn, and that's what I think we hope will happen.
This is a unique part of history and a unique story that nobody else in America has. Why isn't the Department of West Virginia Tourism, the state parks, why isn't the governor and everybody else bending over backwards to find investment to pour into this thing when you could make this a really complimentary part of people's vacations when they come to this park? When they go to the Hatfield McCoy Trails, what do they do after that? What are their other options of things? And we have a gold mine of historic sites and a story that nobody else has. That's just a fantastic story, regardless as to what your political slant on anything is, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. It's just a great story. And why wouldn't you want to tell this story? And it's the embodiment of who we are as a culture, of not, mountaineers are always free. These are mountaineers fighting for their freedom. They're not fighting overseas, they're fighting right here.